Hello and welcome to the Beyond the Technology podcast. I'm Michael Webb, Director of AI at Jisc, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Katy Gooblar, Director and co-founder of Rebel Hive. We're going to be chatting about how data and AI are reshaping the landscape of further and higher education. So welcome, Katy. To start us off,
Thank you.
could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Rebel Hive?
Yeah, so I'm a future of work consultant and facilitator. We've been described as marriage counselling for business before, to give you a little bit of context of what a future of work consultant and facilitator does. My background is as an executive data leader with a specialism in data strategy and literacy. I've spent most of my time in those roles, translating between business and data and tech teams, working in the like the very messy sticky space in between projects, BAU, transformation programs, the grand scale and scheme of complex organizations in working in a senior data leader role. So now this is my focus on working specifically with teams who need to deliver today while still planning for tomorrow and find a friction in that space in between. So right now that's on frictions between people, so teams to team, purpose and that realignment or drift from a strategy or a core business purpose, and new processes. So, centered around the impact of really hybrid working and remote working, as well as AI readiness and the future of work in the sense of how everybody's workplaces and businesses are changing. So, my role very much is helping those people, those leaders navigate that change in the very humanistic translator space.
Okay, fascinating space to work in. So, can we talk a little bit about bridging the gap between data strategy and AI adoption? What's your take on that and what needs to be done?
So I think it's always got to start with why. And I said purpose quite deliberately in my introduction. I use that very often, is because what we're at risk of doing when we talk about strategy is dehumanizing it and depersonalizing it from a business, because we have an interpretation or an assumption about what we mean by data strategy. And that varies. Every business I've worked with has a slight different variation on what we mean by data strategy to begin with. And then there'll be communication strategies and other delivery strategies. So I think even at the starting point of having that conversation about how do we sort of bridge that gap with AI adoption into strategy, we have to ask why. What's the business trying to achieve in its core purpose to begin with? Because I'm of the camp and the firm believer that data and data strategies, it should always be an enabler. So to begin with, it's an enabler to delivering whatever that purpose is, or what across the business that collaboration, that shared purpose looks like. I actually have a personal mantra when I work with organizations and leaders and teams, is I always open with a data amnesty. So I'll say, right, let's get a view of what we all mean by data. And I sit there and I think about the language that's being used. I'm like, I've worked in data a very, very long time. And all of the words that you've used are really boring. Like they're not what get you up and get you excited about it. And that's like the first hurdle. And I see a similarity happening with sort of that AI adoption and interpretation of it. People often think it's something to be feared, and the same as the cycle that we went on with the change of people adopting sort of data literacy and understanding what we mean by data. Starting with that amnesty of, okay, let's all get on the on the same page. What is the purpose that we're trying to achieve? And are these tools, methodologies, capabilities, skills the right ones to enable us to get there? So I think going back to your question about what's my perspective on between strategy and AI adoption, is that we can't shy away from it. It's definitely here. It's definitely expanding more day by day. It's going to be like we all use email, everyday purpose practice, but we want to use it as the right tool for the right job. So I think the data strategy perspective is that, especially from myself, is it should always enable another part of or another function to deliver something. And we need to talk in terms of that something, whatever that might be. So it could be students in this industry, it could be course content, materials, adoption, sort of that alumni viewpoint as well about success and retention of delivery and development. How is AI going to help us do that either better, more efficiently, more ethically sound and in the decision making process? obviously that's wrapped up in a whole load of, governance and risk challenges too. But yeah, that's my perspective on it. Start with purpose.
Yeah, I think the idea about AI being feared is an interesting one, and it's one of these
Mm.
things. The other thing I see a lot, and I don't know if you do, is AI being considered magic that will solve a problem, and people saying, "Oh, we will use AI to solve," and then they point out a long-standing business problem that has probably roots in all sorts of culture issues and things like that, but AI is going to solve it apparently.
Yeah, I'm gonna mess up the quote completely here, but I'm really drawn to the one that believes that, like, if AI is your tool, everything like, and is like a hammer, everything is a nail. And there's so many conversations I've had recently that say, actually, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Could a simple piece of automation do that? Is it a people stemmed problem? Is the symptom being driven by, the hype around AI? What's the root cause of the problem we're trying to solve? And having lost sight of that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, we can use it to our advantage, though, because it's getting people to take a fresh look at problems that have been for a long time and perhaps again think they can be solved. And absolutely, it doesn't really matter if AI is not involved in the solution at the end.
Mhm.
Got people to talk about solving it again. It's a good thing, I think.
I think it's a real success opportunity, and one that we will look back on those who succeeded and those that didn't, is the is exactly that perspective of being able to reimagine the way of doing work or the way of, tackling that problem or task to begin with. Again, going back to that purpose of why what we're trying to achieve to begin with, and then taking the step back. I think what we shouldn't do is use AI as as just tinkering on the edges. I think it gives us a real opportunity to reimagine how we do it. It's almost like that perspective to take that complete innovative view of that, where are we going, what we're trying to achieve. The foundation for that is what worries me, and that's the area that Rebel Hive operate in, specifically, is do we have the skills, capabilities, and knowledge to create that space to do it? So, the I think we often in business, especially, measure performance based on action or activity, and that creates, almost a squeeze of time and opportunity to innovate or to think differently, because it has to be a very psychologically space and trusted space to give somebody the creativity to say, "Let's just rip that up and do it differently." Um, and I think that's the current position that we're in now. What do you see in that space?
Yeah,
Is that
absolutely.
something similar?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I kind of envy organizations that are young and agile and can start with that one AI shaped version of what they're trying to do looks like. And that isn't to take a technology first approach at all, but it's just to imagine it differently if people can focus on different things. And I think the kind of older, larger, more complex your organization, the harder it is to do that. And I see those are the kind of organizations that tend to focus just on how to
Mhm.
what they've always done in the same way, but with a little bit of AI somewhere.
Yeah. I think it's, what's interesting about that, I think, is we're in a really unique sort of paradigm at the moment of different things happening all at the same time. We've got intergenerational workplaces, and there's like 5 times different generations operating within workplaces today, and that's obviously always been the case previously, but, or it's just growing. The extremes of either end of that are growing, and the difference of opinion and thought are happening. And I've read quite a lot recently about the perspectives of we're in a very specific moment and time where we've got a foot in both camps. We know how things were before. We know the way that things are going, and we have the benefit of wisdom of we've been through transformations. This looks similar. It's quite different, but we know what we learned along the way. And I think newer generations are openly worried and discussing, and have a really strong perspective on what are we losing by not having these opportunities, that creative thinking, that opportunity to influence. There's that confidence to challenge and to think differently. And I think that's very present in my mind at the moment.
So I think that brings us a little bit onto leadership and capability building.
Yeah.
So what should leaders be doing in this space, and what should they be spreading across the entire organization?
It's really interesting because, when you referenced before about, the almost that, that jealousy of the agile organization, the opportunity to be fast and responsive and to adopt tools and technologies. When you look at the bigger business and the higher education system, that feeds larger business, they're slow to move. They're legacy organizations who have long, histories and organizational knowledge, and leaders who have worked through hierarchies and have often worked in a rigid structure where leadership was, defined as that progressive model. And that comes to that point I was saying about that cross-generational difference is what we've always known to be leadership and the different if you follow psychological, um, studies on leadership and organizational design, fall into a number of different camps. And I think what we're going to start to see and what leaders need to think and start to prepare for is those skills outside of what was needed just to perform that specific job, and those managerial transactional actions. And this isn't a new debate. This has been the debate between manager versus leader and traits and aptitude and all of the things that have come before. But I think the real variation now is that the structure of organizations is changing. We're starting to see that already, that there's a squashing of the hierarchy. There's fewer in those middle manager roles required because of that, autonomy and independence. So I think for leaders to be able to strive in this space, it's a bigger focus on what does it mean to lead. So that's things like connection, communication, confidence to challenge, curiosity. It's all of those, nuanced behaviors that make somebody, a more approachable, adaptable leader who can take the change and balance the fear of what's coming and their knowledge gaps that they need to develop and understand to work differently today. Alongside that, what is the possibility and space to not be rigid in their ways of working and create that opportunity for others to learn and develop as well. I've actually just finished an MBA, which was on the same subject. So it was about leadership readiness, for AI and human integrated AI workforces. And what struck me most about the findings in it was a thematic analysis. What struck me most about the findings there was the memory and recall that leaders had on good leadership behaviors, and what helped them understand change and change management in times gone past with digital transformation was the clarity of the messaging, was the clarity of what is happening, why is it happening, what are you asking me to do, and why is that of a benefit to me? And not being in a structured way of just delivering change for change's sake. So I think we've all heard the scare stories at the moment where it's saying, a senior leader will just say, "Everybody's doing AI, we should do AI too," without having that role modeling behavior about what does that look like? What does it mean to us? Why is that important to us? What difference will it make to our business, to me, my role? So it is about that clarity of communication, that connectivity between people, teams, AI integrated workforces and activities, and that confidence to challenge. I think that's the key for me is that confidence to challenge behaviors, outputs, understanding enough to be able to query the authenticity, integrity of working with AI.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that really resonates. And a quick plug from the Jisc side, we've just launched a strategic framework for AI for colleges. And um, really, our message for that is quite similar. It's be purposeful. It's put staff skills, culture at the forefront. Try and solve business problems. Don't put technology in for technology's sake. And I, I fear there's something about AI, and maybe technology has always been like this when it's new and shiny, that people start looking for cool and fun things that can do that
Mm,
not necessarily that helpful to the business, but they kind of look good when you show them off. Um, I don't know. There's something about AI that seems to have kind of accelerated that in a way
mm,
because it's sort of has got the veneer of looking human. It's sort of changing people's behaviour, and I think that's the other side of our pillar, good governance, which is really about ethics and doing the right things. So, um, yeah, a lot of parallels there, I think.
I think just to build on what you say, what you were describing there, and having read the strategic framework as well, is I think there's I think there's a really interesting note of the newness of it. So at the moment, and it's infinite development and the speed and velocity of change. But the newness of it has given us a differentiation between, the ways of working gone by to new ways of working, opportunities for us each to develop skills and things that we didn't know or ways of working that are new to us. I think the bit that sits with me that I haven't got an answer to yet, and I may never, but is becoming clearer and clearer, is that similarity of output now. It's the bringing together and the erosion of creativity, I suppose. So we were led to believe that it will build creativity if operated in the right way and the prompts that you need to generate to do that. But actually, when everybody's working in that same way, and as everybody is starting to prompt in similar ways, the outputs are becoming very samey. And lacking that level of judgment and individuality, and um, there's so many different creative options that actually the path to shortest answer seems to be the first thing that comes out, and then everything just sounds the same. And I worry about that in our emerging, um, new sort of like growing, student population as well, is actually, are we creating the behaviors, the understanding and the attitudes to value individuality and personality, or do
Yeah.
we become over reliant?
Yeah, and I think this is really why, um, AI literacy in its broadest sense is really important. So we've done a lot of work in just talking to students. My colleague Sue Atwell leads this work and has spoken to quite a few hundred each year. And actually, I'm really optimistic and heartened by what students say to us.
Mhm.
So first of all, they recognise that risk and they're trying to manage it. Yeah, it's a complex space. If you've got a really busy life and you've got a deadline, and that's the shortest route to getting something done that might still be yours, but perhaps you bypass some stuff. I can understand why it happens, but by and large, most students that we speak to actually want to learn, want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And, we're starting to see the first signs of pushback from students saying, actually, it's negative, over reliance is negatively impacting my learning and my thinking, and I'm going to rethink. And I think that part of this is that certainly the generative AI tools are so new that we haven't really adopted or worked out what best practice is.
Mhm.
I think there are lots of ways that they can actually really help with creative thinking, with coming up with different angles. But it's not by asking it what the solution is. It's by thinking about, God, what don't I understand here? Can it help me dive into something and get up to speed and spark some ideas, that kind of thing. And I think that, gradually, I think we're learning how to do that. And I'm hopeful we can navigate this sameness.
Yeah. I think this is one of the areas where there is going to be that generational divide, and that polarizing of views and entry into workplace, because I think there's a lead in to everybody will use and be efficient and fluent in use of AI, and that's where the literacy and the governance side of that comes in. Um, but I do think that there is that space for that open conversation and that discussion happening. And part of the entry point for that to happen would be overhearing conversations and debate. And I think there's a risk at the moment that every individual has their own co-pilot or GPT or whatever that might be to answer their questions and to work within their response. So the opportunity to overhear conversation and debate is reduced within workplaces as well. Or that debate team in colleges and in high schools even, and into universities is, oh, I want to hear that, and I'm sure that the generations that are in college at the moment and coming through will define that in workplaces and it'll look different. The risk at the moment is, are we preparing people for the skills of the future, or are we preparing people for the skills that we think we need now? And I think they're two very different things because it's hard to imagine that uncertainty and how things will go. But yet, I think it's really easy to listen to that new generation of thinking to say, like you just said, actually, we want to do things differently. It's the same with sustainability and the way and the operation that's very different to my generation's thinking of this and an adoption of it. But I think there's when we talk about the um, those skills sort of for now and for the future, there's a risk very much so of that short-term gain and then the longer term pain. And that ability to have that conversation, to develop those skills if your entry level is so high because you've automated and all of your administration tasks and your conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things spring to mind on there. And um, one, just on the conversation side, actually, one of the things that I actually quite often do with my team, if I've been trying to figure something out and using AI to help, I share the entire conversation.
Oh, I
And
like that. Yeah,
yeah, so you can do that really easily from things like ChatGPT, especially. And I say, look, I've kind of got to this position, and this is my entire conversation. Here, have it. And I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but it's a novel way of using it, and it's been really difficult. If you've been reading a book and
yeah.
thinking in your head, you can't share your thought pattern in the same way.
I like that. I really like that.
I think on the timescale, so something that I talk about an awful lot in my presentations is that the tools we see today are going to have a really short shelf life. And I quite often I like starting. I love talking about history of technology, so I often start with a 70-year history of AI. And I just think if people see that, you can then see these patterns that have emerged, and you always get these short bursts where you think that's the technology, that's how it's always going to be, but that's not the case.
Yeah.
And therefore, I actually think we do have to teach people to use the tools of today, but absolutely not at the expense of the kind of things that you're talking about, creativity, problem solving, communications and things, because they're going to be really important forever, basically. Um, and getting that balance is quite hard, but it's something that I think certainly the university and college sector are rising to and looking to address.
I think there's an important part that I'm not hearing as frequently as I would hope yet, but it's definitely coming, is that understanding of the context. And by this, I mean, at the moment, AI in its infancy believes everything is on equal par. And so therefore, if you submit a process, for example, and say, this is the process we operate, I want you to now perform this process instead of a human. The human who was doing that process initially might say steps 1, 2, and 3 are important. I never do 4, 5, 6. 8 is the vital one. That's the one we need to lock down every time. And 9 and 10 are okay, but they're not the highest thing I want to get from that process. Like
Yeah.
that nuance of understanding the context around a process or a conversation or whatever it might be is locked in sort of that internal knowledge at the moment, so that tacit knowledge of what operation in any scenario. But at the moment, we're not feeding that information fluency and information literacy and understanding context into the tools in the same way. And I think when we talk about the human skills, I think it's as much of an important aspect to really understand what context we're operating in, because give that process to the AI, it'll say steps 1 to 10 are all equally important, and the output is going to measure them as such, and therefore I'm going to perform them equally. Um, and I think that's one of the lessons that we learn when we go into business. When you're new into a business, you hear the conversations from the person who's been doing that role for 10 years. You hear the fallacy of the system that was there before and why it didn't work in the way that people wanted it to or needed it to do, what it needed them to do for their roles. All often led by a lack of communication at the early stages of that tech implementation or whatever it might have been. But it all exists. It's legacy, isn't it? It's there. And I think as we start to move along that journey, AI in its current form is still in such an infancy stage that the challenges around that context and that nuance are really important. And I think that's something, again, around questioning. I think that's asking why. Why do we do it this way? What was the purpose? What was its initial purpose of doing that? What don't I know? What from this situation? And I think again that comes to both leadership and skills for the future is that questioning, that deep sort of nosiness, I like to call it, is like that really understanding why something works in the way it works. And soon I think a lot of that is then behind, you don't get to see that anymore. And there's the whole debate over Excel and the use of Excel and spreadsheets galore and the problems that causes for businesses. But the reality of why people use that, and when you start to explore and have conversations with them, is transparency. They get to see what it does. They get to output a chart. They get to upload it to somewhere else. They get to edit it. And often even migration from like sort of basic data literacy understanding to sort of more BI and business intelligence or management information tools is that lack of being able to see what it does behind the scenes. And I think we're at that point with AI now, is understanding what it's doing, why it's doing it, how it's doing it behind the scenes. For most people, when we talk about it, it sits within the expert sphere.
Absolutely. And I think this is partly why the AI system makers are keen to get access to so much transactional data to help them understand how people really do things. In the education space, Google in particular have done quite a lot of work in this actually. But they
Mm,
started off thinking, right, we can just describe how to be a good teacher. We can just
yeah.
get a big book of pedagogy, write it down into a list of rules, and there we go. And they realized that wasn't the case, and no such book existed, and it was more nuanced. So they started to collect both real and generated examples of conversations between tutors and learners instead, because they realized
Mm.
that's actually where the tacit knowledge really sits. Still at this early stage, but I think that, will that exacerbate the problem? I don't know, because it's encoding the tacit rules in an even more hard to understand way. But I think that the AI makers understand that they need to try and solve this problem.
What's your view, while we're on this space, what's your view on sort of the measures of performance in adoption? Because I sit on the position, I really like Goodhart's law, which is you are what you measure. So if you tell people this, that you're going to measure how much they make, based on volume, they will make one big thing. Versus if you tell them it's on number of items produced, they'll make lots of little things. That's the principle of Goodhart's law. Um, Measuring performance in this space historically has been on accuracy, but I think accuracy of a model masks its true purpose and outcome sort of on the and doesn't take into account cultural issues, like good it doesn't always mean it's good if it's ethically wrong. But yeah, what's your view on sort of measuring performance, especially in this higher education space? Because that's a really
Yeah.
interesting debate.
So I think there's a couple of bits on that really. So in the end, it goes back to I think what we were talking about to start with, and it's about measuring how well you solve the problem that you set out to solve. So it's not a metric of the ability of the AI system at all. It's, did you reduce people's workload to a tolerable level if you were trying to solve an overload in terms of
Mhm.
work, for example? Um, have you increased student satisfaction on feedback in the National Student Survey, if that's what you were trying to target? So I think that that's the level we have to go. I don't think you can look at the individual bit of AI and say, yes, that functions to 78% accuracy and therefore it will be good.
And certainly not on how many agents you've got operating, which is what I'm hearing from a lot of sort of service providers and suppliers and vendors at the moment, is the promotion of just having more agents to do more things. And I'm sat there thinking of times in previous organisations where that was the sales of having more dashboards to deliver on more insight. It doesn't wash. So again, it comes back to, for me, that purpose. It's, are
Absolutely.
we delivering what we are attempting to do as an organization. I do a lot of work with not-for-profits and in the higher education space and purpose-driven organizations. And it has to be, are we delivering the best outcome for the service user, the member, the person engaged with the system, the student, the nurse in previous roles for me. So yeah, how effectively are we doing that in the most efficient and moralistic way?
Yeah. And I think that in some situations, it's going to cause us, we're going to have to look at the system as a whole. Um, so, one that actually we were looking at a conference. So, the idea that AI systems can help improve performance in a subject is a nice one. It can help. There are tools that have proven to help with things like basic maths and English,
Mhm.
which is good. But we fit exam results to a bell curve in the end.
Yeah.
So you can't, it's not going to work to say, to keep the exam system the same as it is and say we're going to improve the attainment of everybody. So I think we're going to have to look at how we fundamentally do things sometimes as well if we're really going to take advantage. Otherwise, we just drive very strange behavior in the system as a whole.
I think there's a real importance to get the right voices in the room and meet people where they are, because I think there is and it's the same issue time and time again. You can just replace the names of the parties involved, but the conversation has to be on those who know the work and the role that they're doing inside and out. So teachers, lecturers, associate, any of the people who are delivering in that context, and the art of the possible, because that disconnection between the two is, it can be quite broad. Is there's often a rigidity of, "This is the way I was taught, this is what I know, I'm comfortable in this space, and I've got to a proficiency level in delivering and being really effective in my role," and that creates that fear of the unknown and an uncertainty. But if delivered and communicated in the right way through a listening exercise and thought conversations rather than a an instruction, bringing together with the right technical people who can say, not in jargon, not in technical terms that are off-putting in themselves, but in a way that says, "Wouldn't it be great if?" And then you can have an open and honest conversation about, how does that change the way that the education system works? Do you know, how does that alter the way that we deliver? And that's a much bigger conversation than an individual um, provider or provision, because that's got to look at the whole education system, like you said, that holistic view. Um, I openly discuss that I'm ADHD. I've had sort of managing tactics and techniques throughout my whole career. It served me well. I know what my ways of working look like. Had I have had generative AI, then I, I I would have operated very differently. It would have enhanced me in such different ways. Just being able to say, what is the purpose of this? Why? Because I need to know why we're doing something in the first place before even being able to start a task. But being able to have that conversation piece with something that would be more co-piloted. I don't think we're there yet for an individual um, sort of support mechanism or personalized learning support. I don't think it negates taking away that human experience of delivery, because equally the memory and recall part of using a tool like AI doesn't have the same neurological stimulation or the lasting knowledge for me. But being able to recap or to synthesize information in different ways or reword it and think of it in context, would have been illuminating for me at the time. I think there's place for both, and I think to fit that in to the schooling system, I think it starts really young. I think it starts, at early entry levels, takes a whole holistic view of the education system differently, um, and that interests me. Requires funding, and there's very little of that, but I know that that's the direction that many in the profession want to start to work on. It's whether there is that conversation and that facilitated space to do that, to the bringing together of the right people and the right parties to have that conversation, and that's the bit I think is possibly missing. I think there's policymakers making and defining what policy looks like based on surveys.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think the hopeful bit perhaps is that it does feel to me like, as a country, we're behind at least acknowledging AI is important and looking how it can change systems. And I'm quite heartened by the approach of public services being part of the conversation and
Yeah.
leading in places as well, which is nice. You talked
Yeah.
a little bit about jargon. Have you any
Mm.
tips on how that can be avoided in the conversation?
Yeah. I come back to, I'll use a sort of real example with this as well. I come back to that whole data amnesty place and starting by meeting people where they are. Um, when I was working with the Royal College of Nursing, and working with nursing professionals, they're working with data day in and day out, and not once do they use that terminology. They'll be looking at patient records, bed occupancy, they'll be looking at medication and prescription and all of the actual terminology. And I think the moment that you include the word data in any of those conversations, you isolate people. And that's not to we use it as a catch-all, and it is. It covers so many different things, but it's built up this fear for lots of people about, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Data isn't me. I haven't done training in that. And as soon as you start to take away that jargon and you talk to people in the language that they're familiar with, um, it becomes more accessible. And I think there's been in history, and I've been a victim of this myself, and I've perpetrated it myself as well, is that you've done all of this learning, and you know all of these things now in the data space, and it was advanced analytics previously, and then data science, and now it's AI. Um, that you fall into the habit of using the language in the books and the training that you've been given in the academic research, and you forget that the people in the room with you haven't been on that journey and may not have that knowledge. And yet, I think bringing it back to what is the problem you're trying to solve? Why does that problem exist? And understanding it gives you the language to be able to deliver it. And then you can start to talk about things that in our world will be things like prediction modeling or sort of the machine learning and the labels that we give to it. But the reality is, they're still the practices. If you use human terms, they're still the practices that we do when we make any decision. Do you know, we're just computing it ourselves slower in our heads, whatever it might be. And when you start to use the examples in real life, like, and I go back to the question I asked before, wouldn't it be great if we could do these things? You don't once need to use those labels in that natural conversation. Yes, if you're doing some sort of write up and a plan on methodology and you're working within your technical teams and you're validating your methods and all of those things, absolutely, that's your audience. But when you're working with leaders or you are a leader yourself and you're trying to sort of innovate and to enthuse other people, the last thing you want to do is isolate them. So when it comes to jargon, I try to I try to make almost a list when in early conversations about, okay, this person called it this. I know it to be this, but this person used this language. And then I'm able to replay that conversation and say, oh, you described X. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Can you tell me more? And often that'll be a data related question. It'll be like, so where do you get that information from? Or where do you get that source of insight that you've just told me about? And then we'll still have that conversation, but without the scariness of, oh, we're talking about hypothesis testing, or we're talking about experimental diagnostics, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just going back to your Data Matters session, without giving any spoilers away, what's the one takeaway that people will get from your session?
So my one takeaway is that it takes a whole bunch of people to move through change and transformation, and
Right.
that has to be part of the foundation of a data strategy.
Excellent. Wise
So
word.
I'm gonna ask that question right back at you, Michael, because you put me on the spot with that one. Um, so why would you say it's a must attend, event?
So, for me, it's the fact that you're in a room full of people that are passionate about data. So I went last year, and it was, I think, people really enjoying connecting with colleagues all working in the same space. And often hearing both new things to think about and practical solutions to the problems they've got day to day.
Excellent. I'm really looking forward to it myself as well. And I'm hoping that part of that discussion covers all pinch points around people, process, technologies, that the session that I'm bringing around that nuance and that space in between is what we've just talked upon for most of this session, is about bringing out those questions to be able to ask. And I'm really excited about seeing all of that dynamic happening in the same space at the same time.
Excellent. So it should be a fantastic day. So if you haven't booked into Data Matters, make sure you do. Thank you very much, Katie. That was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Michael.